Last night I was with the keynote speaker for today, and we made an agreement that each and every second is important. So I would just like to introduce Professor Jesse Ribot. He will just present one of his skills, but his most important skills are into glass blowing, ceramics and pottery, ballet dancing, and filmmaking. So please welcome Professor Jesse Ribot from the University of Illinois.
Thank you very much, Bonn. And I also want to thank Anya and Ailey and Ella for organizing and for inviting me. I feel great to be here. I feel that I am amongst many friends, and there are a lot of familiar faces here and a lot of new faces and new people that I've met over the last couple of days, and some very exciting ideas that have percolated up in the discussions already. So anyway, the talk that I'm going to give today is called Cause and Responsibility in the Anthropocene, Sociodicy Under a Changing Sky. And basically, just to quickly say, sociodicy is, for me, just a way of saying we need to always pay attention to the social as we do analytics of what we understand we are trying to understand and how we understand causality. There's always social within it, and you'll understand by the end of this talk that I don't think it can be separated from any form of research. I don't think there is any way of neutralizing it out. So, I am going to be reading the talk. I don't usually do that, but this material is new and challenging enough for me that to keep my mind ordered, I'm going to go from text. So this talk grows out of two trends in political ecology research. The use of actor network analysis, which you're probably all familiar with, and the appeal to notions of assemblages as ostensible ways of understanding political ecological phenomena, as ways of bringing nature into sociological analysis. I just wanted to start this timer so that I know where I am. There we go. Political ecological analysis and how we bring nature into sociological analysis. Today, I'll focus on the actor network part of these trends. My reactions to these frames of analysis are informed by my experience of uncertainty and precarity among people I work with in the West African Sahel over the past 32 years. It comes from my attempts to understand their vulnerability within a more traditional political ecological analysis, based on process tracing as my method, by which I analyze causality by tracing it out from specific instances of subsistence crisis. So how does something happen? Why does it happen? I trace out causality from actual instances of crisis. Now, I was going to present a case study today, but I don't think time is going to allow, and that was of the crossing of the Sahara by many young Sahelian farmers who are trying to get to Europe to send remittances back home. And these represent the young men crossing the desert. But in any case, that study is underway. I'm working with Papa Faye from Senegal and Matthew Turner from the United States. And we are trying to look at Niger and Senegal and understand, why are these young people taking this trip? Why are they leaving home? What is it about home that is so painful and difficult that they're willing to risk their lives? And in the process, we've been able, the first thing that struck me was the voyage itself across the desert. Many of these young people were dying. And what brought me to Tambacounda was a boat that sank April the 19th, 2015, off of Libya with 729 people on it. There were 29 survivors. About 200 of the deceased came from Tambacounda, where I've spent many, many years doing research, and I went to interview their families, their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, sisters, and other youth who aspired to cross the desert. More people are dying in the desert than are dying in the sea. We hear the ones dying in the sea. This exodus from Tambacounda is stunning. It really is. And yet, they keep going even though they know that the likelihood of encountering all kinds of abuses, including just being robbed, being their money taken by every border guard, being taken captive by Al-Qaeda, the Boko Haram, the Northern Tuareg rebels, two branches of the Libyan military being held for ransom to their parents, whose horse carts get taken away, who sell land and cattle in order to pay off these various passeurs and what have you to liberate their children. They know this and they go anyway. So what makes them so susceptible, so vulnerable? Why are people in Tambacounda, the area that I focused on, leaving? You know, what conditions are they living in at home? And for me, the question is, how do we understand the cause of their decision to leave? Right? It is a decision, and that actually complicated my analysis quite a bit because I'm very much a structuralist and looking at, you know, the sort of political economic conditions that force them out, but they're actually deciding. It's not the poorest that are leaving. But this complex question of causality has to be traced out from instances of departure. So, in our study, rather than flattening and merging the natural and the social, as Latour asks us to do in actor network theory, their separation remains an essential element of analysis. Yes, they can be merged, but I want to point out how they also remain distinct via the elements of human free will, the unique human characteristics called agency. Agency is really important, and I want to emphasize that because we have many reasons to struggle with it. Some, such as Foucault or Nicholas Rose, with his Death of the Social, might argue that free will and thus the social are things of the past. They're dead. But as a deep humanist, let me call myself a post-humanist because I'm fighting against the post-humanists. I believe that even the conduct of conduct, whether under totalitarian or market systems or even under a kind of Rancière-type democracy, does not erase this notion of free will. Even where generated by discourses or driven by impulses, the individual, those that remain persons, a la Hannah Arendt, continue to struggle to find meaning and to act against and within the constraints of state and society. Conduct of conduct may be happening, but people struggle against it. Free will exists even within those small confines. So today, my talk is organized as follows. First, I'll critique so-called flat ontologies that have come to life in recent years as an attempt to challenge human exceptionalism. Second, I will say a few words about humanism and the Anthropocene. Third, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to illustrate it with my case study. So finally, I will come back to Sociodicy and talk in more detail about that, and I hope to show that a full analysis of cause cannot take place without attention to social theory and very human moral framings rooted in human agency. So, part one, unflattening the world. Unflattening the world, climate and causality under a humanist sky. We, that is you and I, value equity, justice, and well-being. These are core critical political economy and political ecology issues, which most of us practice to some degree, right? We're in this question of political ecology and the politics of environment. Analysis, we study the production of these humanly valued outcomes. That's our business. Indeed, analysis without values, I would argue, is empty. We would not do it since we need to value something to be motivated to do research in the first place. Value is inherent in all research. Objectivity, a kind of flattening out of values, is a useful epistemological heuristic, a heuristic for helping us to discern the world. Once we have determined that what we desire to know, that is what we value and want, we frame the world objectively in order to know it, but not before that. And then we come back afterwards and we reapply values to what we attempted to look at objectively, despite that we all know that we cannot be objective for a variety of reasons, which we can discuss later. For many years, I've been thinking about the causes of climate-related risk. Why are some people vulnerable and others more secure? To understand this, I think in terms of empirically tracing out the causes of vulnerability from specific instances of crisis. What predisposes those who are damaged to being damaged? What predisposes them to the loss of valued attributes, such as life, well-being, and income? What, in short, causes hunger, famine, economic loss, or dislocation? I do this in the context of climate stressors like drought in the Sahel. The idea in my current research is simply to explain from the point of departure, the moment that a farmer decides to set out on migration, the causes of that departure. The idea is to understand the social and political, ecological, political, economic conditions of life that make this decision appealing and necessary, even when youth know the grave dangers they will encounter. My interest is in tracing out chains of causality, a la Peirce-Blakey, or progressive contextualization, progressively contextualizing these issues, a term introduced by Andrew Vajda, but made theoretically meaningful by Watson Bola later on. Or I could frame it as tracing out webs of access, a la myself and Nancy Peluso, to identify the historical relations that shape the distribution of assets and protections. We analyze their causes. We analyze causes with an eye to identifying the responsible elements and institutions and to identify potential responses. More recently, an approach based on what are being called actor networks that can be used to trace out relations in which outcomes occur. By the way, note that I say in which outcomes occur because it's just about outcomes occurring. It's not about access, i.e. something of value and human value. Just we trace out in actor networks outcomes that occur. This approach has appeared recently on the scene. It's kind of the new kid on the block. It differs in important ways from analyses of subsistence crisis used since Amartya Sen and later Watson Bola, Blakey, Peluso, and myself. The actor network approach innovates by not being theoretically or historically informed. It has a certain kind of empirical purity, untainted by learning or by the past. Like Andrew Vajda's event ecology, there is no theory or social causality, only directly observable relations. In the actor network model, all forces that impinge on an observed phenomenon are equally relevant. All are actors or agents acting on that phenomenon. This equality is part of what Latour and others call a flat ontology, the collapsing of any hierarchy of judgment or value. And I'll return to this question later as well. So ontology is the study of the nature of being. Latour's flatness is an insistence that being itself has no a priori order or hierarchy. All things are of equal valence or importance. This presumes, of course, that one can know being, not a self-evident presumption. In any event, Latour and many others who are focused on object-oriented or flat ontologies presume this lack of hierarchy. In contrast to the actor network approach, I trace the causes of vulnerability across space and time, that is, history, in order to arrive at two things. One, root causes that can be fixed, changed, influenced. And two, to identify relations of responsibility, liability, or blame that might link us to reparations and response. As the legal scholar Michael Moore, not our beloved hero Michael Moore, who loves the Finnish educational system, Moore, like other legal scholars, including Guido Calabresi, asserts that causation is involved in all liability doctrines of criminal law and of tort law. This is true. Questions of legal liability are embedded in questions of causality. You can't separate them. So for me, cause is a pathway to solutions, and cause is also about the moral pursuit of responsibility and blame, which through sanctions and reparations is, of course, also a pathway to solutions. In other words, I have a normative set of objectives when I begin my work. Solutions of some sort, the human condition, improving it, what have you. As I describe my causal chain approach, it sounds like I'm just tracing out networks of all those actants that made things happen. No, I am certainly not. My aim of finding cause and thus solutions and responsibility cannot be achieved with the flat ontologies of Latour that inform actor network approaches. It cannot be done with the atheoretical assemblages or rhizomatic relations of Deleuze and Guattari. It cannot be done with the radical empiricism of Latour or of Vida. The social world differs from the biophysical world in one key way. It produces agency, whereas the biophysical world does not. Agency is the link to responsibility in causal analysis. Agency is a product of thought. It is distinctly human. It is part and parcel of humanism and is the basis of morality. It does not belong to objects. Objects can contain human agency, though, by being products of human action and intention. But these objects are not acting with intention, even if they carry the intention of those who made them. Again, something that will come up later in the talk. The flat ontological approach of actor networks states that there is no hierarchy between humans and other things, that the subject and object are one, and thus agency, which cannot be directly observed, can be attributed to any thing, a rock, a tree, a storm, that acts upon another thing or even human, since humans in this frame are, given the erasure of any hierarchy, mere equals of things. A thing is an agent by dint of its action, being framed in this case by a verb. If you can apply a verb to it, it is an actant. A flat ontology just goes ahead and attributes agencies to all things to which verbs can be attached. So, first, Latour poses a flat ontology by conflating, indeed, merging subject and object. He considers all things, stories, beings, to be objects while attributing to objects what he calls agency. I object because I am not an object. I do not like anyone reducing me to an object any more than I would promote frames that depict other humans as non-human and therefore non-grievable objects that can be eliminated without sorrow. Butler called these frames of war. The Nazis equated my grandparents' generation to objects, and they killed them. So, I have trouble when humans are equated with objects, or objects with the most sacred of human attributes, agency. My point, also made by Judith Butler, is that we must be aware of any framing that objectifies people. Martin Fougère, who spoke yesterday, talked of an inversion of this, which is the equating of animals with human characteristics. That is the anthropomorphizing, in many ways, of animals, which also can have an effect of dehumanizing or devaluing humans. And these are really important cases to examine, and I wish I were able to do this through a bigger case study here, but unfortunately, the time is too short. Concerning objectivity, yes, we use it when we do research. We study all things, human and non-human, as we can observe them acting on an outcome. This is called research. It is not excitingly new or just discovered by Bruno Latour. This is flat. Okay. We flatten our epistemology. That is, we take the judgments out of our methods of knowing the world so that we can study something and see it other than as we might assume it to be. We create methods to discern what is rather than what we feel or desire. But even in the context of research, we still do not use Latour's flatness, since Latour also insists, as I will soon describe, that flatness erases history and erases theory. When we use flat objectifying approaches as a heuristic, i.e., what I would call normal science, we still pick the research we do subjectively. Okay. We still pick our research subjectively by applying human values to a query. Otherwise, we would not be involved in queries. There would be no motive. We start our research with subjective questions, i.e., reasons within a hierarchy of value to value the knowledge we seek or the endeavor of research. But then we flatten the world temporarily. We then have our findings, and we then reapply a hierarchical ontology, one that depends on values, to what we found so that we can make meaning of it. Otherwise, there would be no reason to do or to know or to even be. Flatness is useful as an epistemological heuristic, but not as an ontology, unless you are completely nihilistic and live in a cold, uncaring, and meaningless world. I, for one, certainly do not. My world is round and filled with people whom I value and whom I feel, who feel joy and pain, and who make decisions according to some set of hierarchical human values. Values that, by dint of being human, cannot do other than place humans at the center of meaning, because they make meaning. Any meaning that we discuss, as they are the origin of the values humans express, right? So, Latour adds, however, two special caveats to his flat so-called ontology, which I would say is really an epistemology. So the two caveats are no theory and no history. This, I would argue, makes his frame useless even as a heuristic. So, my second critique is Latour's claim that there is no theory. He says nothing is reducible to anything else. Theory, however, if you have been paying attention to the world, is a reduction, a tincture of past learning and observation. It tells us which variables and which relations matter, which act, how, and why on outcomes. The moment you throw it away, you are left to start over and to discard the learning of the past. You are not likely to see things like class and broad relations of production and exchange, or interlocking credit labor arrangements, or even to read the contours of discourse if you do not first have an idea passed to us through theory that class or interlocking credit arrangements or discourses are potential relations that are out there and that they can cause outcomes we observe. There was a time when we didn't think and analyze according to these things, and now we do as if they were normal and natural because theory told us to do so. Doesn't mean they're right, but it is how we begin to select the variables that matter and that we observe. And when we observe them, maybe they don't match the world we observe, and therefore we come back and change theory. With theory, we can set up our inquiry to be more likely to observe these kinds of relations. Without theory, all we have are correlations. We become neoclassical economists. Latour's radical empiricism leaves me cold. It erases most of what informs rural political economy. Theory does not tell us what is. It tells us how to observe so that we can see and query empirically what is or what might be, what is or what might be. So it lets us empirically get at it. It's not, theory does not block us from empiricism. It enables it. Of course, it is the difference, the mismatch, or the disjuncture then between theory and what we observe that generates new theory. This is called learning. So, my third objection is that Latour claims that there is no history, quote, no antecedents. Like St. Augustine, but in absence of a schema of meaning, in Augustine's world, that schema was God, Latour sees that all time is the present, and only the present, in which there are only accounts of the past. Yes, of course, this is tautologically true. And as I mentioned, St. Augustine already noted that. But there is still history that comes to us in those accounts, and that we do have means to discern and judge that account for how and where the present emerged. But oh no, in one of his most brilliant statements, Latour tells us there are no antecedents, and observes that the present does not come from the past. Rather, it comes from the future. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. How shall we interrogate the world? By exploring the future? When you get back, tell me how it was. Okay. I shouldn't be so mean. Yeah, so Latour erases meaning, since meaning is hierarchical affair. Erases theory, since nothing can be reduced to anything else. Erases history, since there are no antecedents. He also erases history a second time, since there is no history without some theory by which we organize our interpretation of time. So, he erases it with the first tenet, no theory, by erasing the idea of historiography. But that's just a little detail. So the fourth objection is that the above assemblage of ideas leads to the erasure of causality itself. But this is a very funny matter. This is funny stuff. If there is no history and no theory, i.e. no idea about the repeatable relations among things, then we have erased causality as well. For cause unfolds in time and has meaning when we can presume or theorize its generalizability, prevalence, likelihood, repeatability, or continuity. But in an actor network, being is a one-time affair that can't really tell us much. We are left with descriptions of networks of actants. Yay, very exciting. Fifth objection is that without causality, there is no such thing as blame or responsibility or liability. As the legal scholars Moore and Calabresi outline, and that I mentioned earlier, thus there is no justice, which, by the way, cannot be discerned without a hierarchical judgment. Without causality, there is no moral universe. So Latour has doubly erased justice since he already erased or flattened out human value as an ordering principle of the universe. So in the end, I don't buy it and can't buy it. I live in a socially ordered, hierarchical world. In this world, there are things that matter and things that don't. Those very things that matter, human values, since we do not have any other way of valuing, since we are humans and work from a human perspective, and so valuing of rocks or animals is a human value, and a nice one, and is applied to our interpretations and the making of meaning through human agency, that is, will and intentionality. I would go one step further, if I may. Valuing of human values is the basis of sociality, interconnectedness, in which humans value human values and value the things that humans value over the things humans do not value. Seems like a trivial statement, but it seems that it needs, in this era, to be made. Cause and blame and responsibility are fundamentally social attributes. We can study them as objects, but we cannot act on them without stepping back into the world of our subjectivities. This makes flatness, as I mentioned, an epistemology, not an ontology, right? It just erases that ontological claim. Okay, so now we are done with flat ontologies. I hope I've flattened them out. So, I wanted to say a few things about humanism. Wow, perfect. My timing is on target. I'm doing the Finnish thing, I hope. Now that we've unflattened the world, this is a good moment to segue into humanism. That is, the human exceptionalism that flat ontologies deny, so as to explain its importance in understanding our human role in a changing nature. In my 3D world, my purpose as a hierarchical humanist thinker is to understand the causes of environmental crises precisely so we can attribute responsibility and evoke response, redress, change. The link between cause and responsibility is human agency, the free will, the ability to think and assess, the ability to judge. Agency and will, by dint of indicating freedom of action, link cause to responsibility. It is that freedom, that reflective moment of deciding what valued stance or action to take, that puts causality and responsibility together. Judgment is the other aspect of thought. It is the ability to, in a conversation with ourselves or with others, determine the morality of an action, whether it is our own self-control and moral position or the judgment of society, or the judgment that society takes on actions. And this goes way back in Western thinking, at least. Acting for justice is a judgment. whether we place justice in procedural or distributional terms or both. Action to achieve justice is only called for when there is a judgment that something ought to be done. Ought is a very important term for research. It's an important word. It is a judgment of social expectation. It is a judgment that we have some kind of social contract among us to respect certain basic conditions of life or be sanctioned. It is implicit in the existence of laws, norms, customs, and conventions. These are social expectations, social oughts, shoulds. They are the basis of all human rights. What do we expect or even demand of others? This is what makes society. Do we demand that they do unto others as they would have others do unto them? Do we expect that they respect the social contracts they're embedded in? Do we expect that they'll act according to some agreed on and communicated code? And communicated, I put in there partly because of the special role of language in the ability to be social. The ought that I'm referring to is rooted in moral judgment. Moral, ethical are very problematic terms, but they are essential for tracing the relation between an outcome judged to be morally problematic or unacceptable and its causes, the chain of events that led to it. To blame, responsibility, and response, the attempt to achieve a desired or better outcome. This analytic, from outcome to cause to blame to response, is a social analytic by which we can evaluate the past and then apply to the present in order to improve the human condition. This ought also indicates another hole in the actor network approach. If we remain radically empirical, we cannot measure or observe the role of ought in causality. For the causes related to ought can only be seen when people act in conformity with expectation. We cannot see cause when something is not done unless we know the ought. An ought that may not be at all present at the scene of the action or of the inaction. An ought that operates in very indirect and subtle ways that cannot be observed without great prior knowledge. Right? In this sense, we cannot see causality without knowing the antecedents, the moral expectations in which we live. We must have a notion, or perhaps even a theory, of morality in order to discern cause. This is very important. The flowers died because the gardener fell asleep. But in fact, maybe they just died because they didn't have water, and because the gardener didn't do it, the gardener wasn't the cause. You'd only be able to know that the gardener was the cause if you knew that the gardener had signed a contract to do it or was being paid under the table. And probably the cause of the flowers wilting really was that the gardener fell asleep because the gardener had to work 3 jobs because Donald Trump was blocking people from getting visas, and so they ended up being underpaid. But those forms of causality cannot be seen without understanding some moral framework of what is expected. In short, the moral is a product of human thought and free will. It is a characteristic of agency, the ability to act freely within a hierarchy of judgment. It allows us to define responsibility for good and bad and is thus the basis of judgment and justice. It is the basis of mutuality and the existence of what we call society. Flatness does not give us the room for judgment. Indeed, what is this term justice that is integrated into the title of this conference that we're at? It is a judgment of humans about humans. It is a privileging of some elements of the human experience. Security, well-being, pain or joy, doings and beings that make for the functionings that bring us above bare life and bare subsistence. That, to me, is what justice is about. So the last term I want to bring up is the Anthropocene. It probably isn't the last term, but I somehow feel that I should be at the last term. We need to explore a set of relations that concern justice that I think are of paramount importance in this era we call the Anthropocene. For me, justice is served when people live above subsistence and above bare life such that they are able to enter into political life of the demos, be emancipated so as to be able to shape the political economy that shapes their very security, their entitlements, because they have moved beyond a preoccupation with vulnerability and subsistence. You must be beyond that minimum, I think, to live a fuller life. Today, many people are using the term Anthropocene to construct new ideas about human-nature relations. What is human? What is nature? Is there a distinction? They're breaking down this distinction because they view agency, the characteristic of the human that is based on language and thought that gives us freedom to be distributed everywhere, as if it could be. They are seeing the influence of humans on nature bending back to bite us, such that, so they argue, nature itself in revenge, that's Amitav Ghosh speaking, now has agency of its own. We need to explore the characteristic of human nature relations in an era where the very basis of human life and thus human society and polity are being challenged due to climate change. We need to explore it because, as Pope Francis told us, care for nature is care for ourselves. We need to explore our relation with nature because nature is the basis of life. But we need to also explore it because we humans have the agency, and we alone have the agency that is needed to redress the crisis we're generating and thus are responsible for. So yes, trees should have standing. Objects in nature should have protections attributed to them by humans, for humans, and defended by humans. Because of the rising importance of preserving, let's say sustaining, the nature we rely on, the rising effect of our culturing of that nature via our effects upon it, I think a confusion is being introduced. That confusion is one that depends on understanding that human agency can be present in nature, that such agency in nature is not the agency of nature. It is the agency of humans as it has transformed nature. Oh, on humans, we're already past that. So, human nature. I recently sculpted a bunch of rocks, which I call human nature. I did it to help me understand this idea of the relation between humans and nature. They are rocks made by a human, me. Because a human made them, they embody human agency. Can't you see them? They're breathing. They're breathing as they sit there in the desert. They're breathing as they march across the desert. They're kind of alive. Because a human made them, as I said, they embody human agency. The human agency in them is both my intention and labor that made them. You can even say they contain a kind of love that I put into them. and they are imbued with human agency through the meaning we project into them. Our fetishizing of these objects, our reading of them that makes them into symbols, into logos. They are no longer mere objects. They have human history that makes them recognizable as purveyors of meaning and value. When they affect us, if they do, that effect may be my agency at work. There is thus agency in objects. It is the agency that can be traced back to the human causes of their very being. That's not new either. Marx called it dead labor. There's many ways in which the mixing of labor and land and the creation of property and the culturing of land. We cultivate, we culture the land. This mixing is not a new idea. And I celebrate the agency in things. I celebrate it because it is human. I celebrate it because humans are the only source of agency I refer to and accept. I simultaneously question framings that state that things have their own agency, distributive agency, without human will behind them or within them. For me, attribution of agency to things is a theological stance if there is no actual human input and action behind it. It is a kind of projection that, regardless of the sentiments behind it, it is a projection. The agency in objects is human and will remain so. The objects that act upon us by dint of no human intervention, those objects have force, but not agency. I reserve agency for humans and human action. The distinction is important, for it is the basis on which we privilege humans. This is the characteristic of humans that we value. This is the origins of value in any idea of good or of justice. This is humanism. This is a hierarchical ontology. Humans are moral beings, and our morality can be part of our objective nature. Our nature, our human nature. Acknowledging that humans are part of nature, but that this characteristic, distinct from other nature, is ours. This can be observed empirically. See? I mean, we're talking about it even if you're listening. You're observing empirically that there is this particular characteristic. Thus, human exceptionalism returns by dint of seeing morality as an object. Thus, humanism is. Thus, posthumanism is over. We're living a second coming. We are now post-humans. So my post-human method is simple. It is a mere return to humanism. Trace causality to its origins, those with and without agency. Then evaluate those with agency for their link to responsibility and potential to leverage response. Evaluate all causes for their potential to inform us about solutions to human problems, including the love for nature as a human problem. At this point, the responsibility takes over and takes another form. It is the moral responsibility based on our valuing of humans, and it does not have to appeal to blame. That is to say, if we have knowledge of something, we become responsible for what we do not do to make sure that that something we have knowledge of does not become damaging to humans, right? So, knowledge then can later be applied to blame if we do not act on this valuing of humans, since the mere knowledge of causes that damage humans, even those without agency behind them, generate the should, the ought behind moral action. Sociodicy, that is the last term. I knew there was one more. Lastly, I define sociodicy to be the term for this insistence on identifying the human role in outcomes that matter to us, outcomes that affect human values, including well-being and justice. Cause must privilege social roots so as to have the possibility of society, a society that attends to human well-being and the improvement of the human condition. Now, I want to mention that the word sociodicy, I first came across it with William Connolly. And what William Connolly did was he said, he compared social scientists to theologists like Leibniz, who developed theodicy, which was the justification of the goodness of God in the face of pain and suffering. So how can God be good if all these horrible things are happening, like volcanoes and storms, right? And so he used this as a way of throwing out social theory and social science. But I'm doing the opposite. I think we need to and can do nothing other than justify our existence in terms of the social, because we are social. Our very thought is social. Our very judgment of what is and who we are and what we want to do is social. And therefore, when we talk about causality, we talk about it in order to find out causes we can respond to that may not be social, but therefore, once we know them, they become social insofar as they become part of the ought and the should, and those that do have human agency, and in so doing, are linked to blame, responsibility, liability, and redress, right? So social is implicitly within causal chains. Sociodicy is a good term to pick up in the Anthropocene, precisely because things we use to attribute to God and nature are now influenced by humans. And so, identifying the human elements in things, such as landscapes, species decline, the climate, becomes essential to our identification of cause so that we can include the causes that did not happen, the causes that depend on should, and trace back via that cause from damages to responsibility. Ultimately, these are elements in creating redress. They are also elements in creating new shoulds that embody care for the world around us so that individuals and society use their agency to make a better world. This is a stance that acknowledges the importance of the social in our explanation of the world. It is a humanist stance for a humanist project. Thank you.